Well, I'm gratified to see a full house, and there are even people who are sitting through this for the second time. So, flattered. Okay, so let's get started. What do you think of when you think of the Hearsts, designing a building for the Hearsts? Usually this thing, right? Well, there's a lot more, and we'll explore some of it right now. So here are the clients who were truly groundbreaking as architectural patrons, because they did not settle for the tried and true, what was fashionable at the time, but they hired groundbreaking architects who came up with very unique designs and sometimes revolutionary. So we will talk about the architects, and they are Albert Schweinfurt, Bernard Maybeck, Ernest Coxhead, John Galen Howard, Julia Morgan, and Kirby Pettit and Green. Now, Schweinfurt was the first, and he was born in 1863, the same year that William Randolph Hearst was born, and so they were both in their early 30s when their collaboration began. We have to talk about Schweinfurt because nobody knows about him. And, he was born in New York State. His father was a German immigrant with an architectural ornament business where Albert got his beginning. Then he went to work as a draftsman for Peabody and Stearns, a very successful Boston firm that designed major buildings, not just in New England, but all over the United States. Then he worked for A. Page Brown in New York City. Then he went on his own in Denver because his health was poor, and he thought the mountain air would help. Then A. H. Brown moved to San Francisco, and Schweinfurt rejoined him there, where he was the chief designer. So he's the one, while he was there, who took the major responsibility for designing the buildings, because Brown was more of a society person who went out and got the business. And then for a short period, for 4 years, he had his own office in San Francisco, left to travel in Europe, and upon returning, he died, and he was very young at the time. He was still in his 30s. So while he worked for Brown, he designed the San Francisco Ferry Building, with which you're all familiar. Here's a picture of Schweinfurt on the right, and the man on the left may be Brown. We, don't know for sure. So, and while he was there, he was also involved in designing the Swedenborgian Church and bringing in those incredible madrone trees to support the roof. And as you see, there are elements here that we're also familiar with Maybeck, like the fireplace that's off-center. And then a groundbreaking design in 1893 for the Chicago World Columbian Expo, also working for Brown, was the California State Building. Brown and Schweinfurt won the competition to design this building. Maybeck was another architect who submitted designs, but his was not accepted. And this was the first Mission Revival building to be constructed, and it started a trend. Another building that Schweinfurt was responsible for while he was working for Brown was this administration building at the Midwinter International Expo, which took place in Golden Gate Park in 1894. And then here's something he did on his own in 1894. That was the year that he left Brown. And this was the first Pueblo-style design in California, a country hotel near Motavo. I don't know if it was built or not. This comes from Richard Longstreth's book. And then Hearst discovered him. Hearst owned some property in Sausalito, and he had grand designs there that never came to fruition. He tried for decades to build something there, something very extravagant. It never happened. But you see the red dot is where it was supposed to go. Schweinfurt designed some palatial building. I think there were many objections. It didn't happen. So the seawall, the foundation, is the only thing that remains. And as you can see, that it's covered in moss. But the building above is new. Okay, and then while Phoebe Apperson Hearst was traveling in Europe, William Randolph Hearst decided that he would build a great monument to himself in Pleasanton. The land belonged to Phoebe because it was inherited from his father, the Senator George Hearst, who owned enormous tracts of land everywhere, not just in California, but also in Mexico and other places. So Hearst hired Schweinfurt to design him something unusual, and he got it. This thing had never been seen anywhere before. This is from the San Francisco Call, the newspaper, in 1895. The newspaper called it a Mexican castle, the most unique house in California, throughout typical Mexican mansion. It was really Pueblo style, more than Mexican, I think. And the original name appears to have been Hacienda del Oso. At least that's what the article in American Architect and Building News in 1896 called it. And here is, I don't have a pointer, unfortunately. This is a plan of the ground floor. On the right-hand side are the guest rooms and a bowling alley. At the top right-hand corner, there's a billiard room. On the left side, all along, there's servants' quarters. Above, there's a hall, a dining room, kitchen, butler's pantry, and a library. And in the middle, there's a fountain. Well, Phoebe got back from Europe and found that the thing was being built, and she had never been notified, and her permission was not asked. So she said, "This is mine." She just took it from her son, and had Schweinfurt, finish it. I mean, it finished building it according to his design, and the name was changed at the time because. As you can see here at the entrance, there is a wellhead that came from Verona. Apparently, William Randolph Hearst gave it as a present to his mother, and so this entire estate was named for that thing, that Pozo de Verona, which these days it's at Hearst Castle. It was moved there in 1926 after Phoebe died. Hearst was already building his castle, and so he sold this. And but while Phoebe was still, she was living there, it was her, sort of a country home, and she used it to entertain. So she got a train station called Verona, especially built nearby, so that her guests could come by train from San Francisco and Berkeley. And she had lots of guests there. She entertained a lot. At the time, she was a regent of the University of California, so she was busy entertaining. And this is the music room. Phoebe's music room. As you can see, she was quite a collector, just like her son. Tapestries, pictures, beautiful basketry, you name it, furniture. And this is the drawing room. You can't see the walls for all the stuff. So, okay, so above you see the original design by Schweinfurt. Phoebe expanded it. In 1902, she hired Julia Morgan. Schweinfurt was dead by then. She hired Julia Morgan to expand it, and so you see below Julia Morgan's rendering. I don't know if all of that was built, but changes were made. This is a New Year's card or Christmas card printed for Phoebe Apperson Hearst to send to, her vast collection of friends and acquaintances. At the bottom you can see copyright, I think it says 1902 or 1903 by P.A. Hearst, San Francisco. And this is one of the editions that Julia Morgan designed. Now, after William Randolph Hearst sold it, some businessmen took over and created this dude ranch, which they called Old Hearst Ranch. As you can see, the original buildings are still there in the background. A lot of water was used there because I'm not just talking about the pool. I mean, the vegetation was incredible. I mean, they turned it all green. As I recall, an Austrian physicist by the name of Boltzmann was visiting Berkeley. He was teaching in the summer school, and he was invited to go to the hacienda by Mrs. Hearst. And he said, it takes money to turn all of this green. So this was the dining room while it was a dude ranch. And it burned down in 1969. So that's, it's a country club. It was a country club. It turned into a country club. They lost the building and they built a new one. The country club is still there. So, okay, then also in 1894, the San Francisco Examiner, which was owned by William Randolph Hearst, had a columnist who went by Annie Laurie, and she was always writing muckraking stories about how terrible the hospitals and healthcare was. Nothing has changed since then, apparently. And so she did have a series of stories about a little Jim, I think a fictional character, but and how he was incurable, and there was a need for a hospital for incurable children and all of that. So Hearst took up the cause and established a little Jim fund, and lots of people donated money, and then he hired Schweinfurt to design this thing. So on the right-hand side, you see the old hospital, the old children's hospital. You see an Italianate Victorian design. On the left, those round buildings were designed by Schweinfurt. And they were used well into the 50s, I think. So here you see one ward. There was a lot of lighting in there. It was really modern for the time. And then also, Schweinfurt was hired to design the Hearst building, also known as the Examiner building. So that was also about the same time. And up at the top was this lavish penthouse where Phoebe lived, part of the time, of course, because she had so many other places to live, and she was traveling a lot too. But here is a very interesting postcard showing the building while depicting San Francisco in 50 years, Yeah, we didn't get any of that, unfortunately. Yeah. So this was called Newspapers Row because on the left there's the Chronicle, and in the middle is the Examiner. On the right is the Call building, the one with the round cupola. And then, 1906 happened and it burned down. So, so the Hearsts, of course, wanted to rebuild. They wanted to build higher. I think they wanted more than 20 stories. They weren't allowed to do that. So they did this, 12. So that's still standing. And by the way, they're going to turn it into a luxury hotel. I found out as I walked by it a few days ago. And so Kirby, Pettit, and Green were a New York firm. They didn't choose a local architect for some reason. I don't know why. But it's a firm that had specialized in buildings that combined offices and printing plants. And since apparently the printing plant for the Examiner was to be housed in this building, that may be possible. Also, they designed a building for Hearst in Chicago. So in 1938, Julia Morgan was hired to embellish the facade. So you can see the entrance and the decorations. Those are her work, and the lobby. Many people think she designed the entire building, but that's not true. Okay, and the last thing that Schweinfurt designed for the Hearsts before he took off for Europe and eventually died was the mausoleum that was inspired by the Athena Nike temple on the Acropolis. Here's how, the funeral of William Randolph Hearst. He was actually buried here in 1951. And just because Schweinfurt is important in Berkeley too, here are two buildings not for the Hearsts. This is Weltevreden. You wouldn't recognize it today, only the ground floor remains more or less the same. It's known as Tellefsen Hall. It's the Cal Band House now on the north side. And the other one is the First Unitarian Church on the UC campus, which is now a dance studio. Okay, so now we come to Maybeck. And the first thing he designed for the Hearst, rather for Phoebe, was Hearst Hall, because when she became regent of the university, she needed a place to entertain. And so she had rented that Dutch colonial house you see on the left on Channing Way. And so she asked Maybeck to design her something that could later be moved to the campus and become a women's gym. So it had to be a versatile building, but it was, wow, what a revolutionary building, right? So then when she stopped using it for that purpose, it was actually moved to the campus and became the women's gym. And this is how it looked on campus. And she was very pleased, so she asked him to design something else for her. And this was Wintoon in Siskiyou County. Something it's impossible to see except from the river. Of course, this particular building is no longer there. It burned. We'll get around to that. But it was, this incredible German-style castle. This was the modest living room. Coxhead. Now, Coxhead, his design was not revolutionary, but that's life. We're talking here on the north side, on LeConte Avenue. Benjamin Ide Wheeler lived on Scenic Avenue, and so Phoebe had a house built right next to his with a new reception hall in the middle between them. And her house was connected to the reception hall through an interior passage. So that's what it looked like on the outside. Golden Sheaf Bakery used to deliver in those days. And it's just a very plain colonial revival building, nothing special. Maybe she didn't want to be ostentatious, but this was the courtyard. And here's another picture of it. But it had a huge garden. It went all the way down to the bottom of Hearst Avenue. And this was the university reception hall, built at the same time. In those days, it was only one story, but after it ceased its function, it was purchased and a second story added and became a residence. John Galen Howard. I think you're all familiar with the Hearst mining building that Phoebe commissioned to memorialize her late husband. And on the outside, it looks classic, but the inside is something else. If you haven't been inside, I recommend you visit. It's incredible. And of course, he also designed the Greek theater. And Julia Morgan is often thought to have designed it, but that's not true. She worked for him. I think she supervised the construction. Okay, so now we finally get to Julia Morgan. And Hearst started using her a lot. So first in Los Angeles, the Herald Examiner building, which is a beautiful mission revival building that was recently restored and remodeled by Gensler Architects. And Phoebe was her patron for Asilomar. She largely financed all the construction there. And there were 25 buildings that Julia Morgan designed. Only 11 of them are still standing. This was the YWCA summer camp, you know. And so this was the administration building, and now it's called the Hearst Social Hall. Here's what it looks like in the 1920s. Here's the exterior now, and here's the interior now. The chapel. And the dining hall. And one of the lodge buildings where, you know, the women stayed. I stayed there myself, as a matter of fact. And this is the auditorium that was built later. And impressive. So now we get to Hearst Castle. This was, again, land that was owned by George Hearst. And William Randolph Hearst decided to build here, I guess because Pleasanton was taken away from him. And but he didn't know how to be modest, so this is it. I'm not going to go into detail here because I think you all know it. This is a nice drawing. And now, in the meantime, 1922, Hearst Hall, the one, remember, the revolutionary round designed by Maybeck, was destroyed by fire. And because Phoebe Apperson Hearst had died just a few years earlier, Hearst wanted Maybeck to design something new. And Maybeck was by then not so young anymore. He was in his 60s. And he was more interested in art, I think, than in construction. So this was his idea. You know, he wanted it to be very colorful. This was going to be a new women's gymnasium on the campus instead of Hearst Hall. Well, of course, the money wasn't there, and he didn't want to deal with, you know, the production, and so he farmed out a lot of it to Julia Morgan, so she could generate the construction drawings and all the functional details. And what came out was this gray building that is now very severely in need of maintenance and restoration. Unfortunately, the university is not doing anything about it. So, but it's still a lovely place. And then, as you know, Hearst had a mistress, an actress by the name of Marion Davies, and she bought some property in Santa Monica on the beach and built, you know, a small cottage. But no, she actually did build a small cottage, but that wasn't enough for Hearst. He wanted a big cottage. So, so that's, you know, that's Julia Morgan again. And so here are some pictures of it. Here's Marion Davies herself in her little playpen. She also had a carousel and a pool, of course. And just to give you an idea of how large the place was, look at that. It was a little poolside party. And so this was one of the many salons, drawing rooms. This is the library. And here is something altogether different. Do you know Fort Hunter Liggett in Holland? You can stay there. It's called the Hacienda. It's reasonably priced, and you can stay in the Julia Morgan building. This was just going to be a ranch house, and the ranch hands stayed here. But Hearst eventually sold it to the Army in 1941. That's why it's in Fort Hunter Liggett. Here, an example of some of the rooms. They were all named after birds. Oh, well, not just birds, sorry. This is a larger room. That's why it's Principe Segundo, sorry. And this is the interior of one of the tower rooms where I stayed. And then Wintoun was destroyed by fire, you know, that's so. Once again, Hearst went to Maybeck. Maybeck had grandiose ideas. This was his idea for rebuilding it. It would have cost $50 million. The Depression had just hit, and Hearst did not have the money to do it. So he gave up on that, and instead Julia Morgan designed something considerably smaller. But, you know, very charming anyway. There are three houses, all storybook style, you know, Cinderella House, Brown Bear House, and Angel House. And you can see them from the river, but those are not their fronts, those are their backs. Unless you're invited there, you know, then you can see the whole thing, but it's private. And that's it. Thank you so much for attending.